So here's a question we want to look at now. We've looked at what the theory of evolution says on its own terms. How does the theory of evolution stack up against the evidence, the scientific evidence? Let's go back to and look at the laws of thermodynamics. We talked about those yesterday, most fundamental laws of science. How does it stack up against them? The law of entropy, as I mentioned, is a law that is used to test other theories. And if they do not comport with the law of entropy, the theory must be discarded. So here's what evolution says. Evolution says there's a continual upward progression from the original single cell creation. I shouldn't use the word creation, they wouldn't. Organism to what we are today. Continual upward creation.
And if you follow that through, do we evolve? Oh, you did say we evolved into X-Men, I guess. That's
That's where these concepts come from. You'll see the National Geographic do stuff like this. They will do speculations about what are we going to look like in 100 years or 200 years. Nice, fanciful stuff. So, evolution says there's this continual upward progression and improvement. Entropy says, no, there is not. There is a continual downward progression to decay and disorder. The fossil record does not show an upward progression. It shows extinction, death, and decay and violence. Totally contrary to what the theory of evolution says. So here's a question. How is there order kept in creation if we've got this law of entropy working all the time and this decay? Well, that order in creation is kept by our God in the midst of this law of entropy that came from the fall. It's this, if it was not for God, we would all just simply come apart. But Hebrews says he upholds all things through the word of his power. He has to, because there's a contrary law in effect.
Yeah, and think about it. If his word, I've always heard people say this, if his word ever failed, everything would just
absolutely
collapse, just fall,
we're gone.
Yeah,
exactly right.
If it ever failed.
Exactly right. That's why these areas of these constants in physics, these fine-tuning areas, can be held together.
Right.
Like Jesus says, heaven and earth will pass away, but
my word will not pass away.
It will never fail.
And we're going to talk later about this area of the word. Very interesting stuff. Deep time that the evolutionists say exists is actually fatal to evolution. Why? Because the longer a period of time you have for entropy to work, the more decay you have, not the more improvement you have. You're giving entropy what it wants. You're giving it lots of time to work its effects. It logically goes contrary to the theory of evolution. All life and non-life.
Should be a theory of devolution.
Yes, exactly. All life and non-life obey the laws of thermodynamics. What about the fossil record? Darwin said, with respect to his theory, and we can test him on this, if one part of my theory fails, it all fails. You can't have bits and pieces, he himself said. He said that his theory requires in the fossil record many intermediates between species, because he's telling us that original single cell through evolution has now created everything we see, all the species we see, changes from species to species. So he requires in the fossil record evidence of many intermediates. One species, an intermediate between, then finally down the way, it creates another species. Let's see how this works out for him. Darwin himself, at the time he did his theory, was very disturbed about the fossil record, which was just starting. He found that it did not confirm his theory. But how did he deal with it? He said, look, when fossil excavation is done worldwide and increases on a mass level, we will see millions of intermediate forms. It's just that we haven't done enough fossil excavation. How has that worked for him? Well, fossils that we see in the fossil record actually show little or no change during their history. Most of the fossils in the fossil record are identical to living descendants, because some of these fossils we see in the fossil record, we have living descendants of them today, and they look pretty much the same. Some of them may be on a bigger scale, but you got big dragonflies that look like the dragonflies we have today. They're similar, in fact, if not identical. But if there are none that are alive today in a particular area of the fossil record, these are areas of the record of animals that are extinct today. Here's an example of a type of fossil, a type of previous creature, an invertebrate, that doesn't exist today, that's extinct, called the trilobite. Anybody heard of them? Okay, they're an invertebrate. They came out of the, according to paleontologists, out of the early Cambrian period. Supposedly they would be a very unsophisticated creature. They've actually found from the fossil record that they have the most sophisticated eyes of any animal that's ever been created. Far from being some kind of primitive thing, which the Darwinistic theory says has to be the case. It's got to be more primitive, giving rise to more specific and more sophisticated. And the interesting thing is that in the fossil record there are no ancestors found of the trilobite. Nothing that's kind of, this is sort of an early precursor to another developed layer, and now we get a trilobite. There's nothing in the fossil record of that at all. If Darwin's theory is true, there would have to be, based on his own words. Now let's go to a specific area of the fossil record called the Cambrian explosion. This has been referred to as biology's Big Bang. So Darwin has told us again, no sudden changes. This is what his theory is based upon. Small, minute changes over vast time. Nature does not make leaps. So here's what it looked like before the Cambrian period. There were very limited fossils, very few fossils at all. They find some jellyfish, some sponges, and some worms, but not a long gradual process. They just find these things suddenly appear. But at the beginning of the Cambrian period, suddenly there's an explosion of animal life in the fossil record. Almost every one of the phyla of animals suddenly appear, about 40 types. And the Cambrian period ends with a mass extinction for some reason. We'll talk about that in a minute. Phyla are the major animal types. And in this fossil record of the Cambrian period, there's no intermediate types. All of a sudden, these major types suddenly appear. They're fully developed. They're all different from each other. So there's examples of the arthropods, which are insects and crabs. There's examples of the echinoderms, starfish, and chordates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish. They're all in this record. They suddenly appear out of nowhere almost. That's exactly the opposite of the evolutionary theory. What does this sound like to you?
Creation.
Yeah.
Exactly. Everything suddenly appears in this layer out of nowhere with no intermediate types. So the Cambrian explosion goes completely against Darwin's theory. Remember, if one part of my theory fails, everything fails. Darwin knew about the Cambrian period and the Cambrian explosion, and he said it was inexplicable to him. That might have been a good hint for him to abandon his theory. Darwin's scientific colleagues and contemporaries at the time rejected his work, not on religious or faith grounds, but on scientific grounds. They said it was poor science. It was not confirmed in the records, the fossil record or anything else. Remember I talked yesterday about desperation science? We talked about the multiverse in physics. Well, the guys who are biologists and evolutionists, they're no slackers in this. They have their own desperation science. So now J. Stephen Gould, former professor of biology at Harvard, now passed away, had to come up with an explanation for why we have the Cambrian explosion and why we have an absence of intermediates in the fossil record. He came up with this: punctuated equilibrium. There it is. There's the explanation. Well, here's what punctuated equilibrium is. He says this is what happened, why we don't see the intermediates in the fossil record. He said, I know, nature became static over a period of time, millions of years, and then suddenly, as though evolution was shaking itself out of its slumber and said, what the heck have I been doing all this time? I've fallen asleep. They're going to think that I don't actually exist and that evolution is not true. Evolution wakes itself up and suddenly creates a whole bunch of new mutations so quickly with so many creatures that there's no time for intermediates
They believe
in the
it.
fossil record.
They believe
And
it.
I'm telling you, this is exactly what he has said. Punctuated equilibrium. In other words, slow equilibrium, nothing happening. All of a sudden, boom, 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 boom. Punctuation marks. This is desperation science.
Yeah.
I guess.
I'll tell you a little bit more later about J. Stephen Gould. So let me ask you this. We've talked about the Cambrian period before earlier today. Do you see any significance for this explosion occurring in the Cambrian period? There is a great significance. That's the very period
Before the flood.
that had all the sedimentary rock that is evidence of a global flood. And in that same area, that same strata, the Cambrian period, all these fossils of dead animals, but all happening at the same time suddenly occur. So if there was a global flood, evidenced by huge sedimentary deposits, that's exactly the area in which all the animal types would have been killed. And we would see records of that. And by gosh, don't we? Interesting? Let me read you a statement by another biologist who is an evolutionist. One of the more prominent evolutionist biologists in the world. Here's what he says. Organisms either appeared on the earth fully developed or they did not. If they did not, they must have developed from pre-existing species by some process of modification. There's no evidence of that. If they did appear in a fully developed state, read the Cambrian period, they must indeed have been created by some omnipotent intelligence. At least he has the honesty to say, here's the two alternatives. And if they're appearing fully formed, there's only one solution. There's an omnipotent intelligence. So we're talking about how does evolution stand up against the evidence? Let's go to the 4 sacred cows of Darwinism. These were said by Darwin and his associates to be the best proofs of the truth of Darwinism and evolution. And every one of them has been found to be wrong and several of them fraudulent. But when I took university biology, several of these were still being taught.
It's all gospel, yeah.
And a number of them are still being taught today. So the first is the Miller experiment. Here's a guy who says, you know what, since evolution is true, we've got to be able to reproduce organic chemicals like evolution would have done at the beginning. So in 1953, he does an experiment. And he claimed to have reproduced the atmosphere of early Earth, right? You'd have to do that. What was the Earth's atmosphere like? You'd have to reproduce that to do the experiment. So he puts this soup of chemicals together. He shoots electric sparks through them, that's simulated mutation, to create amino acids. And so his intention was to say, we'll prove that the chance can create life. Well, how has that stood up for him? The consensus of the best scientists in the world now is that what he put together as a simulation of the atmosphere of the early Earth was not that at all. It wasn't anything like that. So, that doesn't work for him. The current beliefs of what the early atmosphere of the Earth was like produced the following substances: formaldehyde and cyanide, toxic substances. So if evolution was true, and if this was the atmosphere of the early Earth, no life would have come about at all. Because, as one scientist has said, these are the components of embalming fluid.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, what?
Embalming fluid.
Yeah.
But the secular texts often still use the Miller experiment as proof.
It's in tobacco.
Let's go to Darwin's second sacred cow and kill them step by step. Darwin said, and he sketched out what he called a tree of life, which started from an original cell, single cell organism, and then began to grow like a tree and branched out as different species formed out of each other to form this wonderful tree. And that was evidence as to how it happened. Well, now that they know that the Cambrian explosion has produced what it's produced, animals all coming at the same time suddenly, out of nowhere, so to speak, they've said humorously but correctly that Darwin's tree of life should be reproduced and presented more like a lawn than a tree, because everything like a lawn vertically appeared once and for all. I would say that Darwin's tree of life is probably more like a knowledge of good and evil type tree.
Yeah.
The third example of Darwin's sacred cows, we've killed 2 of them. Third one, Haeckel's embryos. This was Darwin's strongest proof. Ernst Haeckel was a 19th century geneticist and biologist. And his theory was that the embryos of virtually all animals in their earliest stages are nearly identical. And so that would prove a common ancestor. So if you looked at the embryo of a horse, or of a bird, or a salamander, or a reptile, or a human, in their earliest stages they would all look virtually identical. And that means they all came from a common ancestor. So Ernst presented woodcuts, images carved in wood or drawings of 8 different embryos at 3 stages. The earliest stage showing them identical, and then the later stages showing them different. Well, even during the lifetime of Ernst Haeckel, it became known that he had done this fraudulently, and he later acknowledged that he had. He actually, what he did was he took the woodcut or a picture or drawing of an embryo, let's say of a horse, and then he just stamped it for man, for reptiles, for amphibians, for birds. He was asked why he did that. He said, well, because he knew they'd all be identical anyway.
Oh my.
It was not based on any evidence or truth. And then later on they found also that he had tinkered with the drawings. And his contemporaries knew that.
Tinkered with the what?
Pardon me?
Tinkered with the what?
Tinkered with the drawings. He actually tinkered with the sketches. And later on they found also that even in saying these were all pictures of the earliest embryo stage, they found out that they actually weren't. Even the ones that he actually used were from the middle embryo stage. And in fact, the truth is, when the real observation is made of these embryos, is in the initial embryo stage, they all look completely different. Not at all like. When I was taking university biology years ago, Haeckel's embryos were still put forward as one of the proofs of evolution.
Really?
This same fellow, Stephen Jay Gould, who has the Desperation Science about punctuated equilibrium, he was asked about this and he said, yeah, we've known this for quite a few years that it was a fraud. He said, basically it's academic suicide. But this was his strongest proof, Darwin's strongest proof. His fourth proof, the fourth sacred cow, was the Archaeopteryx. This was the missing link. In 1861, they find what's apparently a fossil with wings and feathers and wishbone of a bird, but lizard-like tail and claws on the wings. Clearly, the missing link between reptiles and birds proves the evolutionary theory. Later on, by qualified ornithologists who examined this, they said, no, this is not a missing link. This is a bird with modern feathers who's now extinct, like a number of other birds, like the dodo bird. So these were the sacred cows, the strongest proofs. Every one of them
just
has been put to a death some time ago. So the interesting thing is that we are seeing, of course, again, as I mentioned earlier, in the public schools, evolution is being taught as rock solid all the time, but its foundations have been gutted a long time ago. Let me tell you some other famous missing links in dinosaur evolution, and these are recent ones. So this is kind of fun. One's called the Archaeoraptor. This was a fossil that was purchased in the 1990s at a mineral show. It had a dinosaur tail and forearms of a bird, and it was trumpeted by the National Geographic as the missing link between land dinosaurs and flying dinosaurs. And in fact, in their 1999 article, they fearlessly and boldly said that feathered dinosaurs are the ancestors of birds. Anybody remember Jurassic Park?
Yes.
They had, the young fellow was with the paleontologist and looking at these reptiles, these dinosaurs called Gallimimus, and they were all moving together like this, and he said they flock just like birds. Here's the example. So it makes its way through
Right.
to the popular movie thing, and of course people look at that and they say, and obviously this is correct.
Yes, on TV.
Well, in fact, the Archaeoraptor was nothing that they said it was at all. It was no missing link at all, because they found out it was a deliberate fraud by a Chinese paleontologist. Because at these mineral shows, you can make lots of money if you produce an ostensible missing link, and that's what he did. He sold it for huge money. He glued a dinosaur tail to a primitive bird fossil.
Included.
There you go.
Man, I missed that all the time.
Yeah, included and got rid of it.
All right, but not to be undone, we have Bambi Raptor, also in the 1990s. This is a great era for missing links, the 1990s. Florida Dinosaur Conference. A chicken-sized dinosaur is presented by paleontologists as the missing link. You'd think they might have had a clue in on the Archaeoraptor.
Yeah.
They then reconstructed a model of this showing feathers on it. The only problem is that on the original fossil, there were no feathers at all. No evidence of any feathers. And they were asked, reasonably enough, why did they have put them on it? Here was the answer. Because they thought they should be there. They thought they should be there. And so they reconstructed this as though it had feathers when there wasn't any evidence on the fossil itself. And they used artificial bird's eyes, like you do with eagles or other raptors, in this reconstruction. So of course it started to look like a bird. 2018.
So if the evidence isn't there, just make it up.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. And I haven't finished yet. There's more. 2018, Sharon and I are going to the Royal Ontario Museum because we now live in Toronto, center of the universe. I say that sarcastically. And there, proudly displayed in the dinosaur section, was a bird-like dinosaur, Bambi Raptor. And underneath it was the caption, "Birds are modern dinosaurs."
Jeez. So they're still doing this.
Still doing it, you know, unapologetically. How about turkey DNA in dinosaur bones? At the same dinosaur conference as our friend Bambi Raptor came in, paleontologists had another tremendous discovery. They found turkey DNA in a 65 million year old dinosaur bone. But as one of the world's top biologists said, when asked to comment on this, he laughed. He said, only modern turkeys have 100% turkey DNA. Nothing else that has ever lived has 100% turkey DNA. So he said, well, how would this have happened that these guys have found this in this dinosaur bone? He laughed and he said, contamination. He said, if that had been found in my lab, I'd have said to my worker that found this, go and wash your hands, wash the specimen, and test it again. He said, if you had a turkey sandwich or anything like turkey on your hands when you were doing this, it would contaminate it. But Science magazine, one of the august science magazines, published these results and said that this was proof, but this was a contaminated sample. So how does the evidence, the fossil evidence in the dinosaur area, stack up? How does evolution as a theory stack up against the evidence? Let's turn to famous missing links in human evolution. Anybody heard of Java Man?
Yes. Bigfoot.
Java Man is one of the ostensible missing links. And if any of you have seen the parade of human evolution, you know it starts off with the chimp, and then the next guy is a little more erect, and the next guy is a little more erect. As I say sarcastically, it's because they've been at the chiropractor, they're getting a little better mobility. In this parade of human evolution, Java Man proudly appears. He was found in an 1892 excavation and was trumpeted as the 500,000-year-old missing link. This is the intermediate between pre-man and man. Here's the only remains they had for him. They said, by the way, he had a smaller brain capacity than man, and he was definitely not Homo sapiens. The only thing they had to produce this result was a little piece of skull cap, 3 teeth, and a thigh bone. Based on that, they did a full head bust of this creature, and placed it in the American Museum of Natural History, where it remains to this day. Later on, bad for them, they found that the thigh bone was actually from a different type of creature altogether. So they had to discard it, and they were left with a skull cap and 3 teeth. Okay. Well, later on they examined this further. A group of experts examined this, and they said this is clearly human remains. This is not an intermediate creature at all. And they published in 1992 a 342-page expert report saying this is human remains, normal brain capacity. How many people do you think read that 342 pages?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's the first one.
Probably just about zero. But that didn't stop Time magazine. In 1994, Time magazine puts Java Man on the cover 2 years later, after this report, 2 years later on the cover of the magazine, and says this is the missing link. Apparently hadn't got the memo of the 342-page report. How many do you think read the Time magazine article? Lots.
Wow.
1988 edition of Origin of the Species from Darwin. Java Man's on the parade in the cover. Piltdown Man, 1912. Another missing link was found between apes and man. They found a skull, a jawbone, teeth, and primitive tools. Oh, that's got to cinch it. Human-like skull, but a jawbone like a chimpanzee. They proclaimed again it was 500,000 years old, and it fulfilled all their theories and expectations. 41 years later, 1953, they found it was a fraud. Somebody had altered an orangutan jawbone and teeth and fitted it into a human skull. These are some of the missing links. Neanderthal Man. If you've seen the movie Encino Man, that's the supposed representation of Neanderthal men. Previously considered to be primitive cavemen, as they call them. New studies have actually found them to have been highly intelligent, with a cranial capacity at least the size of modern man. And a Christian orthodontist was asked to do an examination of some of these remains. He found that they lived actually lifespan between 250 and 300 years. Longer lifespan than modern man, at least the same cranial capacity, sounds suspiciously like the people from biblical days that lived longer ages than we did. And his examination showed, although they were thought to be 30,000 years old, that they were not that at all. They were much more recent and current. So here's a summary question. How extensive is the fossil evidence of human evolution? Because we get the impression that there's tons of these things out there they're finding all the time. A man by the name of Henry G., who is the chief science writer for Nature magazine, said that the fossil evidence for human evolution for the period between 10 and 5 million years ago, ostensibly, if we accept that period for argument's sake, would fit into a small box. There's hardly any of it. And here's the comment that he made, chief science writer for Nature magazine, said that the conventional picture of human evolution is a completely human invention created after the fact, shaped to accord with human prejudices. How about that? Let's turn to another test.
Can I say quick? So to me, the obvious question is that this is all spontaneous evolution, that is. It would be happening all over the place still.
Oh, yes.
Why would it have quit?
Oh, no, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So why aren't we seeing animals crawling out of the ocean that are half people
You do
now?
have punctuated equilibrium.
They'll be doing it.
No, I mean, totally reasonable.
Yeah.
Totally reasonable
It makes you
question.
wonder how many of
That's
these
the
guys
obvious question.
were committing fraud and knew they were committing fraud.
Absolutely.
That's the thing.
I mean-
Including Darwin.
I mean, these guys are not going to get paid at academic institutions for
Right.
proving the Genesis is correct.
Exactly,
Right.
right.
There's no money in that.
It's like the whole climate thing, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Let's look at the next proof or test of how evolution stacks up. Darwinism and irreducible complexity. So here's Darwin's own test that he gave us. Here's a quote from Darwin. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. This is in Origin of Species, his book. So there's been a test done of Darwin's test. and it's the concept of what's called irreducible complexity. Dr. Michael Behe, a world-class microbiologist, biochemist, and committed Christian. And it relates to a test of and is based upon the complexity of living things. And so here's the definition of irreducible complexity. I mean, these terms sound like they're really complicated and so on, but it's actually straightforward. It says, and the definition would be a living system, like an organ, or any device, even a man-made device, is irreducibly complex if it has several different components that all work together to accomplish its function such that if you remove any one of them, the device or the organ won't function. Now, I said to you earlier yesterday that I wasn't going to do any technical stuff here, and I kind of partly lied to you, so you're going to have to bear with me. Because I'm going to give you a demonstration. We're going to get into an area of complexity here for a minute. Anybody tell me what this is?
Mousetrap.
Well, you guys are good. This is not bad, I thought this technical stuff would be difficult. So a mousetrap has a number of components, and by the way, I wish I came up with this, Dr. Behe did, but here's the illustration. A mousetrap's a man-made device. It has several components to it. It has a wood base, and it has other structures that have to hook into that wood base. It has like a clasp, a lever like this. It has the hammer.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Exactly. And this clasp that hooks into a little hook,
Yeah.
and that would be the end of the mouse if
Yeah.
it works. Every one of these things, and by the way, what's the purpose of mousetrap? I know I can count on you guys. To catch and kill a mouse. This is an irreducibly complex device. Why is that?
Take any part out of it and it won't work.
That's exactly right.
I'm thinking of a car.
So I now produce to you Exhibit B, a mousetrap, right?
Yeah.
No.
No.
I don't
It's a
know.
piece of wood.
Block of wood.
So let's take the whole process of Darwinistic evolution and test this. This now comes on the evolutionary process. It's presented to Mr. Natural Selection, and they say, hey, we got something for you. What is it? It's a mousetrap. He says, that's not a mousetrap, that's a piece of wood. That doesn't do anything. That's not a working system. And Natural Selection says,
Oh,
You're done.
too.
so not to be daunted. I can find my other pieces here. Where did I put those? Oh, here we go. Evolution comes up with something else and says, no, we got a mousetrap. And Natural Selection looks at it and says, that's just a piece of metal. That's not a mousetrap, that doesn't do anything. Trash heap of biological history. Well, at least we've got this clasp. It says that's just a piece of, that won't catch anything. And so what happens based upon Darwin's own theory and approach is that this system, because indeed it is irreducibly complex, you remove one piece
Right.
and it doesn't work. This fails the evolutionary test. Now this is probably the most simple device that you can imagine, a mousetrap. But it itself is evidence of intelligent design, and it is irreducibly complex. The simplest cell on Earth is irreducibly complex. Much, phenomenally more so than a mousetrap. It can't happen by evolution because it is composed of multiple millions of interdependent, interactive parts. And if you remove any of those key parts, the thing does not work. And so it does not pass go and does not pick up $200 through natural selection. The human eye, now ramp it up a huge level beyond that. Much more complex than any single cell. There is no possible way that it can even be conceivably produced by evolution because it has a huge number of complex interdependent parts, all of which have to be working together for the thing to work, or natural selection says, non-working system, away you go. It has 100 million light-sensitive cells, 1 million nerve fibers to the brain. Evolution can't produce them all at the same time. Why? Darwin says it can't. It can't, by his own theory. You have to have one initial small thing that leads to another. Suddenly you've got an eye.
Oh, yeah, so,
I'm not gonna go through all the structures of the eye, and Greg would know them far better than I do, and of course he could maybe criticize me as I'm describing them. But it has a number of significant parts to it. The sclera, the pupil, the iris, the cornea, the lens, the retina. Every one of those has to function together,
right.
or you've got no eye. You've just got a piece of tissue. Gradual evolution means that all along the way there are missing parts, like the mousetrap. Darwin was disturbed by the human eye. He said, to say that it could have been formed in a few steps is, quote, absurd in the highest possible degree. You would think that would have led him to say, my theory is
Yeah.
absurd in the highest possible degree.
Yeah.
So there are many other examples of irreducible complexity, both in man-made devices and in the human body. So, Darwin and Darwinistic evolution fails the test of irreducible complexity. How about microbiology? Let's look back at the cell again. The evidence of microbiology refutes evolution. One principle of science is what's called the law of biogenesis. That means that all life comes from life. And furthermore, it says that the offspring will always be of the same kind as the parents. What does that sound like? Does it sound at all like Genesis?
Yeah.
Everything reproduces after its own kind?
Yeah.
Well, the naturalists had to come up with some kind of a counter theory, and they came up with abiogenesis, which means life can come from non-life, which contradicts the law of biogenesis. And they're asked, well, how does this happen? And they said, well, here's how it worked. Life came from non-life only once at the start. And then after that, the law of biogenesis kicks in. It's all life from life.
Yeah.
I mean,
They pay people to teach.
they pay people to teach
I need
this.
to get one of those jobs.
And they sell textbooks based on this. This is as good as it gets in terms of their explanation. They have no evidence for this at all.
I don't know how it grew legs and walked, because it just falls apart when you just really look at
It
it.
does.
It evolved.
The cell, the
Right.
cell is the
Yeah.
simplest unit of life in organisms, the simplest thing. In the human cell, there are 1 trillion subatomic parts, and we have anywhere between 37 and estimated 60 trillion human cells. All the parts interact. They all have specialized roles. This is complexity at its highest in our basic functioning. The smallest living thing is the simplest of the bacteria. Even they have millions of subatomic parts. So the simplest cell is far too complex for evolution to take place. In fact, biologists have said that the cell is simply thus the most complex machine in the universe.
Wow.
Here's a catch-22. Life has 3 key molecules. One is DNA. DNA contains the master plans or the blueprint for the creation of our cell structure, which is composed of proteins. Scientists tell us that 1 strand of DNA alone contains enough information that would be contained in 1,000 books of 1,000 pages each. So we got DNA. We have RNA. RNA transports the blueprint of DNA to assemble proteins, to make our cells, to make us. And proteins are the things that make up these cell components and structure. Life's 3 key molecules. They're all completely interdependent for life. So here's what I call God's catch-22. DNA is the blueprint that's required to create what they call cell machinery. Biologists call them cell machinery, which are devices in the cell. But the cell machinery must first exist to be able to read the blueprint. So you can't get the blueprint enacted without the cell machinery, but the cell machinery can't be created without the blueprint. So they both have to be there at the same time.
Right.
They can't exist separately. And here's the further catch-22. How does the DNA get here in the first place? The cell machinery makes the DNA. So you have to have the cell machinery before the DNA, but you have to have the DNA before the cell machinery because it's the blueprint. That means they all had to be there at the same time, simultaneously.
Right.
Does that sound like creation?
Mark.
They find that there are 75 different proteins required to carry this blueprint for proteins to be made. But these proteins that do this and create the process are themselves created by the same process that they're used in. So they had to be there at the beginning,
Has to be there.
and the process had to be there in the beginning. So which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah.
Well, creation is what satisfies and solves that for us. None of these could involve separately because evolution is a linear process. In the cell, there are complex, again, what they call machines that process food and oxygen for the cell to survive. If those pieces of cell machinery that process food and oxygen are not there in the beginning, the cell can't survive anyway. So they have to be there. The food supply and those that create the food and oxygen supply have to be there at the same time. In other words, and I'm beating this one to death, you have to have a fully functioning unit
Right.
right at the start, or it doesn't work. Here's an analogy that Sir Fred Hoyle, we talked about him a little earlier, I gave a quote, an analogy he gave. And here's what he said. The probability that life came through random processes is equivalent to believing that a tornado striking a junkyard would reassemble the trash and leave a completed, assembled, and fully functioning Boeing 707 there. Good statement by Sir Fred Hoyle, but Sir Fred Hoyle is also an atheist. And he also engages in his own desperation theory, even guys that make good, cogent comments. He's doing this by observation, but you can get some dumb ideas. So Fred Hoyle is asked, how does life come in the first place then? He's got the answer, panspermia. Panspermia apparently is an idea held by certain scientists, including Sir Frederick Hoyle and Francis Crick, co-founder or co-discoverer of the DNA. And they say, well, what caused life on Earth is that there are other civilizations way, 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 way out in the universe, more advanced than us, and they have the components of life, and so they seeded it throughout the universe to create life at certain places like Earth. Panspermia. Sounds like desperation science to me. It's what my dear wife Sharon calls ABG, anything but God.
Yeah.
Anything but
Good
God.
one.
Let me read you another nice little bit of evidence and odds. The odds of one protein molecule having been formed by chance. We go back to Dr. Michael Behe, the guy of irreducible complexity. Here's what he says. The probability of linking together just 100 amino acids, these are these basic building blocks of life, to create one protein molecule by chance would be the same as a blindfolded man finding one marked grain of sand somewhere in the vastness of the Sahara Desert and doing it not just once, but 3 different times. How's that for odds? You see, the whole area of evolution from a probability logical basis is simply ridiculous, based on scientific evidence and based on statistical odds. Let's turn to another test for evolutionary theory, and I call it language in life, information in the cell. 20th century biology has made it clear that all life develops and functions from what it calls coded language structures. That is, language structures in the cell that form a code or information in the cell. And this information, these coded language structures in the cell, allow parts of the cells to communicate with each other. And so here is what are the details of what's referred to as coded language structures. DNA, which we talked about, stores information by something called nucleotides, which has been described by biologists as a pattern of chemical letters. Interesting word, isn't it? Chemical letters. And these letters are abbreviated to ATCG. Adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine. These are chemical compounds. This coded information is carried on chemical molecules in our bodies, in the cells, and it forms, this is the words of biologists, it forms words. These are letters in our cells that form words by 3-letter combinations of this ATCG. If you have many DNA molecules, they make up genes. If you have many genes, they make up chromosomes, which results in our heredity. You've probably heard the word genome.
Yeah.
Genome means our complete set of genes. We're told by geneticists that this code in each human being is 3 billion characters long, this code. And it must be in the exact right order for you and I to be created.
Wow,
Oh.
wow.
How does that accord with chance?
Mm-mm,
How does that accord with the theory of evolution?
mm-mm.
These gene codes give instructions inside the cells to make amino acids, and amino acids make proteins, proteins make cell structure makes us eventually. The key is that DNA has been analogized to like a paper and ink of a book. You know, a book's got paper and it's got ink marks, but they're not random ink marks. They come from prior intelligence. They contain information. Well, books, by comparison to what's contained in our DNA, is just primitive stuff. Detailed information and codes are in our DNA in the form of these letters. If books come from a prior intelligent source, they're not just random ink marks thrown on paper, how all the more can it not be that what's in our codes in our cells comes from a prior intelligent source? Chemical letters that form words, that form a code, that form our cell structure. What does it sound like for biologists to say that there are patterns of letters that form words, that form the structures in our cells? To me, it sounds like this. In the beginning was the Word,
Mm. Amen.
and God said.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it interesting that they say that we actually in our structures are composed of chemical words? And God said, and God spoke, and we were.
Wow.
Here's another key for this code.
Wow.
To make proteins, they found that there has to be a sender of the code and a receiver of the code in the cell. And they have to agree in advance as to what this code is going to be in order for proteins to be made in our body. They have to agree in advance. There's a communication that takes place in the cell. If there's not that communication and agreement, that process can't take place. How does that reflect on Darwin's chance mutations? Because mutations are damages to these letters and these words and these codes. If you damage one of these things, the sender and the receiver have no agreement between them. Because the receiver is saying, what is this? I don't recognize this code. Something has happened to this code. I can't make these structures. An altered code is sent. It's like a house builder that gets a blueprint that's part house and part boat. He's looking at me and he said, I can't make this. I can't read this. This doesn't work. This is embedded in the very essence of our beings and our cells.
A quick comment.
Yes, sir.
It seems evolution is counterintuitive if you accept that the more complicated anything is, the more likely any change to it is going to make it worse.
Absolutely.
Which
Very good point.
I think everybody accepts that.
Exactly.
The more complicated something is, any
Yep.
change is more likely to make it worse.
Absolutely.
So evolution is saying, well, we're getting more and more complicated.
Right.
But and these mutations, these changes,
Yep.
are making us better.
Exactly. And they're based on random
Right.
changes that only create non-functional results.
That's just so counterintuitive.
Totally counterintuitive. And yet the whole theory is based upon this. So mutations are errors in the copying of DNA, errors passed to offspring. They're mistakes. They're not functional things. Letters, these letters in the code through mutations have been either changed or lost, or bad ones have been added. And yet evolutionists are still trying to tell us that these errors make new, good genetic information. So here's
It's like saying water flows uphill, right?
Exactly, exactly. So here's a comparison that somebody has made. If you had a computer program on a computer and you put a child on that computer and you let the child tinker at the keys, will those changes made by that child, those random changes, improve the computer program, or will they destroy it? It's pretty intuitive that they would destroy it.
But if you give them billions of years.
Yes, exactly.
Give it a long enough.
And billions of destructive
Eventually
codes.
they'll improve it.
Yeah, there we go. Richard Dawkins, our famous atheist, was asked, can you give an example, one example of mutation causing positive changes in organisms by adding new information? And he said, I am not.
I don't know.
I am not.
You didn't say yes or no, you just said you didn't know.
So let's go to another level. Let's play the devil's advocate with our evolutionists for a moment, because they say that this DNA mutation could cause good changes to produce new life forms, the X-Man, and all those kinds of things. Okay. We've already seen, based upon the evidence, that it's impossible for these random changes to cause beneficial changes, to cause life at all. But let's say we give them the benefit of the doubt for their silly ideas for a moment. Something else has been found to create just another roadblock, door slammed shut on their theory. Something called epigenetics. What we've been talking about with DNA and RNA and so on is all genetics. Epigenetics, and the word comes from something that means above genetics, separated from genetics. Epigenetics has been found to be a process that, in addition to DNA and genetics, is critical to life. In other words, if you have genetics alone, you can't get life. You also have to have the process of epigenetics. And here's how it works. It tells us that information that we talked about in the cell, those coded things in the cell, do not alone occur in the DNA. They actually occur in the structure of cells itself apart from genetics. And they are needed separately from genetics to produce protein, to produce cells, to produce tissue, to produce organs, to produce us. And what they apparently are mechanisms in this epigenetics that turn genes on or off. Because in our genome, we have a variety of different possibilities they found. In our genome, in our genetic makeup, each one of us, there was a possibility at the start for brown hair or blonde hair, blue eyes or brown eyes, dark skin or light skin, tallness, shortness, and all the various capacities that are in people. We actually apparently contain a number of these things. It's not just that we've only got these specific ones. Epigenetics is the process that actually turns them on or off as a switch. It goes through and it says, brown hair, turn off blonde hair. Blue eyes, turn off brown eyes, and goes through that whole process. So that what geneticists are saying is, well, all you need to do is have mutation in the genetics, and these things can happen. You also need epigenetics, and they have found that epigenetics cannot be mutated. Even if genetics can be mutated in a damaging way, epigenetics cannot be mutated. So they've got another door slammed tightly in their face when they tell us that this process can occur by random chance. So I want to just give a bit of a summary, because I'm talking about this whole area of how does evolution stack up against the evidence? It fails the laws of thermodynamics. It fails the fossil record. It fails in particular the Cambrian explosion. It fails the 4 sacred cows of Darwinism because they're dead. It fails the evidence of the dinosaur supposed missing links and intermediates. Do you know how many missing links have been found in the fossil record of either dinosaur or human record, human structures? How many missing links? How many intermediates? 0, not one in the entire excavation of all these fossils. Darwin said there would have to be countless millions of them. It fails the test of the absence of missing links in human evolution. It fails the test of irreducible complexity, It fails the evidence of the complexity of the human cell, or any cell for that matter. It fails the evidence of chemical information contained in letters and words in the DNA. It fails the evidence that mutations never cause positive salutary changes, but destructive changes. And it fails the test of epigenetics. Evolution in the theory completely fails the evidence. And that test of the evolutionary theory points us in only one direction. There clearly, obviously, was a creator. No question. Today, Darwinism is still taught unabated in the public schools, in colleges, universities, and in textbooks. A number of them still include Java Man, Cal's embryos. You will never see, unless you have someone who's really going beyond the comfort zone as an instructor, intelligent design taught. Here's a quote from C.S. Lewis about evolution. I grew up believing in this myth, evolution, and I have felt and still feel its almost perfect grandeur. Let no one say we are an unimaginative age. Neither the Greeks nor the Norsemen ever invented a better story. But the myth asks me to believe that reason, human reason, is simply the unforeseen and unintended byproduct of a mindless process at one stage of its endless and aimless becoming. The content of the myth, evolution, thus knocks from under me the only ground on which I could possibly believe the myth to be true. If my own mind is a product of the irrational, how shall I trust my mind when it tells me about evolution? Pretty good statement. I'll read you a couple of statements from world-class scientists. We have not the slightest chance of a chemical evolutionary origin for even the simplest of cells. This comes from Dean Kenyon, a biochemist, a former evolutionist, and co-author of an evolutionary textbook, which was a cutting-edge evolutionary textbook called Biochemical Predestination. And in this statement that he has made, he repudiated the conclusions of his own book. Now that is integrity. That is the kind of scientific integrity that is called for. You're looking at the facts, you're looking at the truth, and you will change your viewpoint if it doesn't comport with facts and truth.
Good.
We need more people with the integrity of a Dean Kenyon. My conclusion, this is another quote, is that the case for Darwinian evolution is bankrupt. The evidence for Darwinism is not only grossly inadequate, it's systematically distorted. I'm convinced that somewhere in the not too distant future, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 years from now, people will look back in amazement and say, how could anyone have believed this? Darwinism is merely materialistic philosophy masquerading as science, and people are recognizing for what it is. Jonathan Wells, doctorates in religious studies, molecular and cellular biology, senior fellow in the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute, and former atheist.
When did he say that?
When did he say that?
Yeah.
I think it was sometime in the 1980s, late 1980s, I believe.
So I guess it's 20 or 30 years.
He's got his 20 or 30 years. Yeah, he was maybe optimistic. Another quote. This is from Francis Crick, biochemist, co-Nobel Prize winner for discovering the structure of DNA. An honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. Good statement by Francis Crick, but like Dr. Fred, he believes in panspermia. But here's something, and I'll close with this, a quote from Albert Einstein. We are in the position of a little child entering a huge library filled with books in many different languages. The child knows someone must have written those books. It does not know how. It does not understand the languages in which they are written. The child dimly suspects a mysterious order in the arrangement of the books, but doesn't know what it is. That, it seems to me, is the attitude of even the most intelligent being toward God. We see a universe marvelously arranged and obeying certain laws, but only dimly understand those laws. Our limited minds cannot grasp the mysterious force that moves the constellations. How about that?
I love
Yeah.
that.
It's good stuff.
That was good, yeah.
So folks, the best science currently and increasingly confirms that there is a creator. And I want to encourage you to take this material, because every one of you has the full capacity to take these facts and this evidence just as much as or more than I do, and putting them together and using them to convince people and set aside their biases with respect to the evidence of a creator. I want to encourage you to do this and to have the confidence to do this. People who are presenting to us confidently, whether they're guys with a PhD attached to their name or just kind of somebody in the street who's read a National Geographic article or Time Magazine article, is coming to you with flawed information. It's nothing like the best science. It's old, discredited science, and yet they'll come to you with confidence that they're right and that you're just completely out of touch with reality. No, you're the ones with touch with reality. I want to encourage you to use this as a grounds for evangelism, or grounds for persuading people to come to the one who we know as the Creator.
Amen.
Thank you for being here. It
Amen.
has been a privilege for me to talk to you, to have the privilege to be here, and I want to encourage you in this process. Add this as something to your evangelistic arsenal, a fuller worldview that we want to increasingly walk in. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.